Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Officials in Gaza say Israel's killed at least 111 Palestinians over the past 24 hours, including 91 people seeking food and aid. Over 800 Palestinians have been injured. In the deadliest incident on Wednesday, at least 51 were killed by Israeli forces as they headed toward aid trucks at the Zikim crossing. On Wednesday, Palestinians gathered at Al-Shifa Hospital to mourn the deaths of family and friends killed on Tuesday while seeking aid.
You can ask anyone. For 3 or 4 days, you couldn't find any food. People were either dying of hunger, even in intensive care units, you find them starving with nothing to eat. Or we would die in the places of death, the places of killing and destruction, where we go to get something to eat but end up bringing back our children to bury them.
On Wednesday, Canada became the latest country to announce plans to recognize a Palestinian state, joining recent calls by France and the UK. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney spoke in Ottawa.
Canada intends to recognize the state of Palestine at the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly in September 2025. This intention is predicated on the Palestinian Authority's commitment to much-needed reforms, including commitments by the Palestinian Authority's President Abbas to fundamentally reform its governance, to hold general elections in 2026 in which Hamas can play no part, and to demilitarize the Palestinian state.
Israel blasted Canada's move, calling it a, quote, reward for Hamas. President Trump wrote on Truth Social, quote, that will make it very hard for us to make a trade deal with them, unquote. Meanwhile, Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, has arrived in Israel as ceasefire talks have stalled. In the UK, a high court has ruled the co-founder of the direct action group Palestine Action can challenge the Home Secretary's decision to ban the group as a terrorist organization. Under the ban, membership and direct support of Palestine Action is punishable by up to 14 years in prison. Since it was banned, more than 200 people have been arrested for publicly protesting in support of Palestine Action. That includes an 83-year-old priest and an 81-year-old retired magistrate judge. Meanwhile, the Board of Deputies of British Jews, the largest organization representing Jews in the UK, has called for a, quote, massive and sustained flow of aid into Gaza. The organization also condemned Israel's starving of the population of the besieged Strip. It comes as Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced the UK will recognize a Palestinian state unless Israel agrees to a ceasefire. On Capitol Hill, more than half the Democratic caucus voted Wednesday to block $675 million in U.S. arms sales to Israel. Senator Bernie Sanders had introduced the measure, which ended up being defeated in a 70-27 vote. Senator Sanders spoke from the floor before the vote.
The United States has provided more than $22 billion for Israel's military operations since this war began. $22 billion. One estimate based on Brown University research calculates that the United States has paid for 70% of the Gaza war. In other words, American taxpayer dollars are being used to starve children, bomb schools, kill civilians, and support the cruelty of Netanyahu and his criminal ministers.
The U.S. has sanctioned Alexandre de Moraes, the Brazilian Supreme Court justice, in charge of the criminal case against the right-wing former President Jair Bolsonaro, accused of attempting a coup after losing the 2022 elections. The U.S. also slapped Brazil with 50% tariffs on imports. President Trump signed an executive order announcing the tariffs, specifically citing the justice for abusing, quote, his judicial authority to target political opponents, unquote. President Trump has expressed his admiration for Bolsonaro in the past, calling his trial a witch hunt. Bolsonaro is often referred to as the Trump of the tropics. In other trade news, Trump has announced 25% tariffs on India and new penalties against India for purchasing Russian oil. Trump also announced a new trade deal with South Korea, setting the tariff rate at 15%. We'll have more on Trump's trade deals later in the broadcast. After a historic trial, former Colombian president, close U.S. ally Álvaro Uribe, has been convicted of witness tampering and bribery. He'll be sentenced Friday and faces up to 12 years in prison. The case centered on efforts by Uribe to bribe imprisoned members of paramilitary groups to retract damaging testimony exposing his ties to right-wing paramilitary groups. Uribe ruled Colombia from 2002 to 2010. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio criticized Uribe's conviction. In Texas, Republican state lawmakers have formally introduced a plan to redraw Texas's congressional districts with the goal of picking up 5 more Republican seats. The Texas Republican Party has called the effort a, quote, essential step to preserving GOP control in Congress, unquote. Democratic Congressmember Greg Casar said the GOP gerrymandering will result in the, quote, illegal voter suppression of Black and Latino Texans. Under the plan, Casar's district would be redrawn. Meanwhile, California's Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom is pushing to counter Texas by redrawing California's congressional maps to add more Democratic seats. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has admitted a new Trump plan to create savings accounts for newborns is actually a backdoor way to privatize Social Security. Bessent made the comment Wednesday during a forum organized by the right-wing news outlet Breitbart.
I'm not sure when the distribution level date should be, whether should it be 30 and you can buy a house, should it be 60, but in a way, it is a backdoor for privatizing Social Security.
Democratic Senator Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire responded by saying, quote, they're already ripping health care away from millions on Medicaid, and now they've made it clear that your Social Security is next, unquote. In other economic news, the Federal Reserve voted Wednesday to hold interest rates steady, defying pressure from President Trump, who visited the Fed last week to personally lobby for lower rates. In a rare move, 2 Republicans on the Fed dissented, expressing support for lowering rates. During a news conference, Fed Chair Jerome Powell emphasized the importance of the Fed remaining independent. Trump has repeatedly publicly attacked Powell, calling him a total and complete moron and a numbskull, as well as a disaster. A Senate committee has advanced a bill banning stock trading by members of Congress, the president and the vice president. President Trump slammed the lone Republican who voted for the bill, Missouri Senator Josh Hawley, calling him a, quote, second-tier senator, unquote. That's despite a carve-out Hawley added to the bill that would exclude President Trump. The bill would require elected officials to divest from their stocks at the beginning of their next term and would apply to the president and the vice president starting in 2029. The bill faces steep odds in the Republican-controlled Senate. Harvard's prepared to pay up to $500 million to settle 2 federal lawsuits brought by the Trump administration. That's according to the New York Times, which reports the emerging deal would unfreeze billions of dollars of frozen funds for research grants and contracts while preserving Harvard's ability to enroll international students. This comes just days after Columbia University agreed to a $221 million settlement after Trump threatened to cut off federal funding, accusing administrators of failing to protect Jewish students against anti-Semitism during campus protests against Israel's assault on Gaza. Meanwhile, Brown University said Wednesday it's agreed to a $50 million settlement that'll restore federal funding for medical research. Brown agreed to comply with the Trump administration's demands to end the consideration of race in its admissions policies. It'll also enforce a ban on transgender athletes in women's sports. Meanwhile, the Trump administration's freezing $108 million in federal research funding to Duke University after determining its affirmative action policies constitute racial discrimination. In California, immigration officials at San Francisco International Airport have detained a South Korean-born researcher and longtime permanent resident for the past week without explanation and without access to a lawyer. Tae-Hung Will Kim moved to the U.S. when he was just 5 years old. He's a doctoral candidate at Texas A&M University, where he's working on a vaccine to prevent Lyme disease. He was detained July 21st after returning from a 2-week trip to South Korea to attend his brother's wedding. A federal appeals court has rejected the Trump administration's bid to rearrest Columbia University graduate Palestinian activist Mahmoud Khalil, while the government appeals his release on bail. Wednesday's ruling by the Third Circuit Court of Appeals also affirms a lower court ruling that the Trump administration cannot seek to deport Khalil over his lawful First Amendment-protected speech in support of Palestinian rights. Mahmoud Khalil is a U.S. permanent resident married to a U.S. citizen. New York's Democratic mayoral nominee, Zohran Mamdani, is calling for a nationwide ban on assault rifles, like the one used by the gunman who opened fire Monday on the Manhattan high-rise that houses the NFL's headquarters. After returning from Uganda, where he celebrated his wedding, Mamdani visited the Bronx home of Didarul Islam, the New York police officer who was killed in Monday's mass shooting. Speaking to reporters after meeting with Islam's family, Mamdani distanced himself from a call he made in 2020 to defund the police and accused his opponents of politicizing the shooting.
And what I would also say in this moment is that it is beyond me that politicians are looking to use these days to score such cynical political points on the very day that I held the father of Officer Islam in my arms, as he could not utter a single word, and as I felt him sobbing at the memory of his 36-year-old son, who will never come home.
Ukrainian officials say Russian drones and missiles struck the capital Kyiv overnight, killing at least 8 people, wounding dozens of others, including a 6-year-old boy. Russia's attack came hours after Ukraine's parliament voted to restore the independence of 2 anti-corruption agencies following widespread protests and pressure from European officials. Thousands demonstrated in the streets after President Zelensky's ruling party tried to push amendments that would have allowed his administration to transfer cases away from the agencies. And Israel's released U.S. labor activist Chris Smalls and the Tunisian activist Hatem Ayouni. They had been detained on Saturday with 19 others with the Freedom Flotilla Coalition when Israeli forces raided their Gaza-bound aid ship, the Handala, in international waters. Earlier this week, the Freedom Flotilla Coalition revealed Smalls had been beaten in Israeli detention. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Thanks for watching Democracy Now! On YouTube. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to make sure you never miss a video. And for more of our audience-supported journalism, go to democracynow.org, where you can download our news app, sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to the daily podcast, and so much more.